Welcome to the video on absolute value. The SOL objective is 6.3 and the student will identify and describe absolute value of integers. And at the end of this video you should be able to say, I will be able to find the absolute value of integers. I will know that absolute value is always positive and that it is the distance a number is from 0. I will also know that opposite means that a number will have the opposite sign. So absolute value. Absolute value is the distance a number is from 0, or the number of units from 0. And absolute value is always positive. So let's take a look at this number line below. So when we talk about absolute value, all we're looking at is how far away from 0 is this number, or how many units. And a unit is just the space between the little tick marks. So -3 is 1, 2, 3 spaces, or 3 units from 0. +3 is 1, 2, 3 units from 0. So both -3 and +3 have the same absolute value because that absolute value is always positive. With absolute value, we're not looking at positive and negative. All we're looking at is how far away from 0 is this number. So the number of units or distance between an integer and 0 is called the absolute value. That's what we just talked about. So how many units away from 0 is -10? Well, it's 10 units. And how many units away from 0 is +10? Again, it is 10 units. So definition, the number of units or distance between an integer and 0 is called the absolute value. The absolute value of an integer is never negative because it asks how far away from 0. It's never negative. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the arrow to help decide if -15 and +15 are the same distance from 0. Notice that the arrow comes in the same distance and it goes out the same distance, so they are both the same distance from 0. So yes, they have the same absolute value. All right, let's take a look at this explanation of football. So it says on the first play of the game, the running back makes an 8-yard gain. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and circle the 8-yard gain. Unfortunately, the play is brought back because there's a problem with the game. So now we're back at 0. Now on the replay, the quarterback is sacked for a loss of 8 yards. Now we've already learned our positive and negative integer terms, and a loss means it's a negative number. So he is absolutely furious. So if we lose 8 yards, that would be -8. Now we could say that the absolute value of an 8-yard gain and an 8-yard loss have the same absolute value. So both of them are 8 units from 0. Alright, so what was the gain on the first play? It was the 8 yards, and the loss was also 8 yards. So that's the absolute value. -8 and 8 have an absolute value of 8 because they're both 8 units from 0. So think of absolute value as the value of the number regardless of the sign. So let's take a look at this. So the absolute value of -6 is 6 because it's 6 units from 0. Oh, there we go. The absolute value of 4 is 4 because it's 4 units from 0. The absolute value of -2 is just 2 because it's 2 units from 0. And the absolute value of 11 is 11 because it's 11 units from 0. So what we're going to do now is we are going to incorporate some of what we've been doing with integers. So first we're going to look at, is -4 larger than or less than, or greater than or less than 3? Well, it's less than, because all negative numbers are less than positive numbers. Let's take a look at the next one. We have 7 and 4. Well, we know 7 is bigger than 4, or greater than 4. Now in the next set, what we have to do is we have to solve them before we can identify which is bigger. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4 because it's 4 units from 0, and the absolute value of 3 is 3 because it's 3 units from 0. So now looking at this, this changes the answer to our problem when we take the absolute value. So 4 is greater than 3. Now let's look at the next one. We have the absolute value of 7, which is 7, and the absolute value of negative 7 is also 7. So we would say the absolute value of 7 is equal to the absolute value of negative 7. Now here we have negative 1 and 6. Now all negative numbers are less, so negative 1 is less than 6. So let's take a look at it at the bottom. Now we have the absolute value of 6, which is 6, and we have the absolute value of 1, negative 1, which is 1. So 6 is greater than 1. Now while the inequality symbol is still facing the same number, or if it was an alligator, it'd still be eating the same number, which won't always be the case as in up here. See, it changed once we took the absolute value, but here it did not. And that's because 6 is still bigger than 1 regardless. Let's take a look at the next one. The absolute value of negative 10 is positive 10, and the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So 10 is greater than 5. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down and say the absolute value of 10 is greater than the absolute value of negative 5. Alright, let's take a look at the next one. Now using a number line, negative 10 is smaller than negative 5. So negative 10 is less than negative 5. Alright, now two integers, so let's go ahead and go back to your notes. Two integers are opposites if they are each the same distance away from 0, but on opposite sides of the number line. So one is positive and one is negative. That's what we were just looking at with absolute value. But absolute value is different than opposites. Absolute value is the number of units from 0 that a number is, and it will always be positive. An opposite just has the opposite sign. So think of waking up. What's the opposite of waking up? Going to sleep. What's the opposite of adding? Subtracting. What's the opposite of dividing? Multiplying. So whenever it's the opposite, we're automatically changing the sign. So the opposite of 10 is negative 15. The opposite of negative 15 is 15. So all we're doing is changing the sign to its opposite. So if it's positive, it becomes negative, and if it's negative, it becomes positive. So what I want you to do is take a moment, pause the video, and in your notes, just find the opposite of each of these numbers. And then when you come back, the answers will be here. Okay, so let's talk about these. So the opposite of negative 5 is 5. The opposite of 9 is negative 9. The opposite of 3 is negative 3. The opposite of 6 is negative 6. The opposite of negative 4 is positive 4. And the opposite of 8 is negative 8. Alright, so that is the end of our absolute value and opposite video. If you have any questions, concerns, anything at all, please jot those down in your notes and we can talk about those during the next class. Thank you.